I'm a comic book writer creator. Uh, Probably I'm best known for I've done Marvel and DC work like Two-Face Year One, things like that. But I'm mostly known for creator-owned work like Graveyard of Empires at Image, and I'm doing a Kickstarter for a book called Chaotic Neutral, um, which is a fantasy. It's inspired by fantasy role-playing games, and it's both a comic book and a fantasy role-playing adventure all in one, drawn by and co-created by Chris Anderson. I grew up playing fantasy, huge fan and player of fantasy role-playing games. I've been an RPG fan as long as I've been a comic book fan, which is childhood. What happened to comics in the 50s in America with the Comics Code, where they really self-censored, happened to role-playing games in the 80s, and they removed any reference to things like demons or to allowing you to play an evil player character, and try to soften things down. And so what we wanted to do was to write a comic, to create a comic that was as if, I think our tagline has sort of been, what if role-playing games were as dangerous as your parents told you about, warned you about? And so ours is like, in some sense, is like trying to recreate like an artifact of the 80s. So I'll hold up the book. So, because it's, the comic itself is already done. This is a test print. We need the money to actually print loads of copies and ship it to people. But you can see there's like the black and white art inside. Well, we want to capture that edge of like, ooh, this is this game that we weren't supposed to play when we were kids. So we're trying to create that. The story itself is basically about these characters that you don't usually see. I think in fantasy stories, they're not adventurers when the story starts. The princess is supposed to be rescued, but would rather have a more interesting, would rather have an adventure herself, and it's about their journey to be to becoming heroes. And then there's an adventure that sort of takes place at the same time. So if you're somebody that plays Dungeons and Dragons or another fantasy role-playing game, you can kind of test your own skills against the foes they face and see if you'd make different decisions. And anybody that likes fantasy, you don't need to know Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing games to appreciate the comic, which is, the comic itself is 48 pages. And then there's an additional adventure module, that sort of will fill the rest of the book. In terms of books that are like this, that's a really good question. I know, I'm very fortunate enough to be friends with Kieran Gillen. I love his book, Die from Image. It's probably one of my favorite books out there. I think that's, if you like that book, it doesn't have necessarily quite the same meta aspect to it that does. But I think if you enjoy that, like that's definitely, Kieran was nice enough to give us a shout out and say some nice words about the book. So hopefully it'll appeal to, fans of that. I know IDW puts out the official Dungeons and Dragons comics, and there's that Conan comic from Marvel. There's Tolkien. Okay, that's clearly was an influence on it. I would say also Robert E. Howard's Conan. That's another obvious influence. But there were some less obvious ones that were really interesting. There's an author named Jack Vance who wrote wrote a bunch of things. He's a science fiction and fantasy author. I love these books called Dying Earth, or these stories that were part of this Dying Earth world that he created, which is sort of, it appears to be a fantasy world, but it's really so far in the future that anything technological is magic. And that was an influence. These stories by Fritz Leiber, Fard and the Grey Mouser. There's a Lovecraftian influence in it. I definitely read more modern fantasy too. I'm a big fan of China Miéville, and I guess it's Scott Lynch that writes I forget his series of books. And but I do read more modern fantasy, and I've read like Saladin Ahmed. I've read his stuff, but I try to sort of keep this to its sort of pulp fantasy roots. Again, taking out, like trying not to carry over things that might be problematic from those books because they were written, some of them were written 100 years ago. And Michael Moorcock would be another person in the Elric stuff, but trying to take what still can resonate about those stories and bring them, bring them into this. With film, I always find, like, again, like when you actually think like pre Peter Jackson, like there really weren't a ton of fantasy films, but the ones that stood out for me certainly are Excalibur, Dragon Slayer, Krull, which maybe is not the most wonderful movie, but as a kid, that spinning blade, I think it's called the glaive in the movie, was just blew my mind. So those kind of books those kind of movies are in the back of my head. I guess one other movie I should mention is there's a movie called, it's a television movie released in the States called Mazes and Monsters. And it was with Tom Hanks. And the idea of it was, again, it was part of the Satanic Panic, where Tom Hanks' character, he was a teenager then, plays a fantasy role-playing game and gets so obsessed in it that he can no longer distinguish fantasy from reality. And his friends have to call him by his character name. And I think he's institutionalized or something like that. I guess the other thing I should mention, is also, people who are fans of Stranger Things, I think, that's the era that's, they obviously Dungeons and Dragons is a huge part of that, the friendship of the characters in those books. And there's that's the era that this would have been, that Chaotic Neutral would have come out. If we were doing this literally 100% like we were doing in 1983, it would have just been, would have been all white male characters, except for like a girl in a chainmail bikini. And, that was of its time, but I feel like the comics, it's one of the greatest things I've experienced just being a creator, is seeing how much more diverse the audience has gotten. Chaotic Neutral has lesbian and gay characters and bisexual characters. And it's got, it has, I feel like you wouldn't use the word African American in a fantasy world, but it has characters of color in it. And that's in addition to, to fantasy races and all that kind of stuff. And we've tried to be, I would say, equal opportunity with any nudity that's in the book, where there's male demon nudity and there's and to not be to just generally not sort of be there's some nudity where it makes sense, but it's not gratuitous or exploitative. In terms of the other artists, so we've got, let me see who I can name offhand, but it's Jim Rugg and Max Dunbar, who does the official Dungeons and Dragons comics, and Dan Panosian and Tim Seeley, and Mon House and Jeremy Hahn. We've got an incredible series of artists. So some of that is just, some of those people have Ryan Brown played in a role-playing game with me. Some of those people have, I teach with Jim Rugg at the School of Visual Arts. I teach a writing class, he teaches an art class there. The rest has just been, I've been in the comic industry now, I guess this was year like 15 or so of me being professional. So I've been lucky enough to have not only good friends, but evidently very generous friends who are generous with their time and talent. And so they've been really kind of, they were also excited by the idea, I think. But so their involvement in the project is, we're doing these it's like a $10 add-on, or you can do it as part of a tier. But these monster trading cards, which are essentially, on one side, there's wonderful art by these 9 guest artists. And on the other side, there's stats for that would be compatible with Dungeons and Dragons, and little descriptions of the monsters. But it was fun because I would say almost all of them are original monsters. None of them are copyright Dungeons and Dragons. There's some things like skeletons that maybe I'll have a slightly different take on, but they're original monsters. And so I would just give them literally 1 or 2 sentence description, and they would just run with their imaginations. A couple things just really quick, which is that Chris, in addition to offering original art from it, is offering to do character sketches. So if you're somebody that plays a role-playing game, and could be in any genre, he'll draw your characters for you. He's done it for the players in our Dungeons and Dragons group, and we now use them as tokens because we play virtually. And then one thing that I'd love for people to take me up on is I'm offering to run the adventure that's in Chaotic Neutral as Dungeon Master. So if people want to have a chance to play with me and the person who wrote the module, maybe we can rope Chris into, but definitely I'll be running it. That's one of the higher rewards, and I'd love the chance to get to. It's one of my favorite things about comics is just the ability to interact with fans. It's been it's such a great experience. So this is a way of sort of taking that to another level.